Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
We have a very dense stack of sources today. We're covering 12 distinct pieces from the daily, ranging from, well, the intricacies of wind turbine data all the way to the sociology of marriage in small-town India.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
And I want to start with a piece from the editorial section that feels like it's addressing a really deep sort of structural flaw in the Indian state. It's titled, "The Case for an Indian Scientific Service."
Right.
Usually, when we talk about science and government, the argument is always about budget allocation. Does ISRO have enough cash? That kind of thing. But this source is arguing that the money is almost irrelevant if the people managing it, the scientists themselves, are being governed by the wrong rule book.
Precisely. It's a fantastic point. It's an argument about the entire operating system of the government.
The operating system, I like that.
Because the editorial points out that India's scientists, and we're talking about the people responsible for everything from climate modeling to AI policy and nuclear safety.
The really high-stakes stuff.
The highest stakes. They're all currently governed by the Central Civil Service's conduct rules from 1964.
1964, wow. I mean, that's an era of typewriters and carbon paper. The world was a completely different place.
It was. And the issue isn't just the age of the rules, it's the philosophy behind them. Those rules were designed for generalist administrator.
Right, for the IAS.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For people whose primary job post-independence was to maintain order, stability, and hierarchy. The core values of that civil service are, discipline, neutrality, and anonymity.
And the core values of science are the exact opposite, really.
Almost the polar opposite. The core values of science are skepticism, constant questioning, peer review, and critically, the duty to flag risks when you see them. The editorial argues that these two value systems are fundamentally incompatible.
That makes perfect sense. If you're a district collector, your job is to implement policy,
Yeah.
to follow orders to keep the peace. But if you're a climate scientist and you see data that directly contradicts a government policy on, say, emissions, your professional duty is to speak up. But under these 1964 rules, that could be seen as insubordination, couldn't it?
It absolutely could, and that's the chilling effect. The source argues that this makes scientific input in the government reactive instead of proactive.
What's the distinction there?
Well, a crisis happens, or a lawsuit is filed, and then the administration calls in the scientists to provide a defense or a quick fix.
So they're the cleanup crew.
They're the cleanup crew. The goal is to move to a proactive model where scientists are embedded in the policymaking process from day one, shaping it with data, not just justifying it after the fact.
There's a very sharp line in the text that stood out to me.
I think I know the one you mean.
Science that cannot question policy is not science. It is a decoration.
That's it. It's a damning assessment. It implies we're using our best minds as, window dressing.
So the proposed solution is an ISS, an Indian Scientific Service. Is this just about giving them a fancy new title and a pay bump?
No, it's about structural independence. The proposal is to create specific, dedicated cadres.
Like what?
Things like an Indian climate and atmospheric service, or an Indian artificial intelligence service, maybe an Indian regulatory science service. The key difference would be in recruitment and protection.
Okay, so you wouldn't hire a top AI researcher based on a generalist civil service exam.
Exactly. You'd hire them based on their scientific rigor, their publications, on peer evaluation. And then looking at models that already exist in the U.S., the U.K., France, these services would likely have legal protections that allow them to document dissent without fearing for their careers.
So in theory, if a political appointee tries to bury a report on glacial melting because it's inconvenient,
the scientist has a formal protected channel to say, I object, and here's the data to prove my point.
that's a crucial distinction. It's about moving from just administering science to actually governing with science.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's move from the slow gears of bureaucracy to a system that is moving incredibly fast. The second editorial, the India-UAE corridor.
This is a story about just completely defying expectations. When India and the UAE signed their Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the CEPOL, back in 2022, they set a pretty ambitious target.
Which was?
$100 billion in bilateral trade by 2030.
Right. And usually with these big government targets, you kind of expect them to miss, or maybe, if they're lucky, hit it right at the deadline.
They hit 5 years early.
5 years early. That's frantic growth.
It really is. And because they smashed that ceiling so easily, they've already set a new target, $200 billion by 2032.
Wow.
But, the numbers are actually less interesting than the type of trade that's happening.
Right, because the lazy assumption is that this is just India buying oil and the UAE buying, I don't know, jewelry or spices.
That's the traditional exchange,
Yeah.
energy for commodities. But the editorial highlights that non-oil trades, so everything else, grew nearly 20% last year alone.
To what level?
It's now at $65 billion. We're seeing a massive pivot toward advanced manufacturing and technology.
The examples in the source were genuinely surprising. I mean, Ashok Leyland moving its electric bus production from the UK to the UAE.
I know. You usually hear about manufacturing moving east to Asia, not to the Middle East.
It's a sign of a major strategic realignment.
It is. And you also have Larsen and Toubro building a massive solar plus storage project in Abu Dhabi. And then there's this thing called the Farat Mart.
Which sounds like a giant shopping mall for Indian goods. Is that what it is?
Think of it more like a forward operating base for trade. It's a huge wholesale hub being built in the UAE, but the goods aren't just for the local market there.
So it's a logistics play.
Exactly. The idea is to use the UAE's incredible logistics dominance to push Indian exports into Africa, West Asia, and even Eurasia. It turns the UAE into a gateway, not just a destination.
And it seems they're future-proofing this relationship with technology, specifically with the upcoming AI Impact Summit in New Delhi.
Well, the UAE has been serious about this for a while. They appointed the world's first Minister of State for AI back in 2017.
You were early on that.
Very early. By partnering on things like data centers and computing capacity, India is ensuring this corridor is about the future digital economy, not just the old fossil fuel economy.
From booming trade to a much, much darker set of statistics. Let's turn to the opinion section and this piece, India's evolving death penalty landscape. The data here presents a very disturbing paradox.
It does. The source analyzes the state of capital punishment as of the end of 2025. And on the surface, if you just look at one number, the death row population, you'd think India is executing people left and right.
Okay, so what is that number?
The population on death row has surged. It's at 550 men and 24 women.
And that's a big jump.
It's a 43.5% increase just since 2016. The queue for the gallows is definitely getting longer.
But are they actually executing anyone? That's the key question.
No, and that is the paradox at the heart of this piece. The lower courts, the sessions courts, they're handing out death sentences very aggressively.
Okay.
They imposed 1,310 death sentences in the last decade alone. But when those cases move up the chain to the high courts for confirmation, which they have to,
They get struck down.
massively. The rejection rate is huge. Only 8.31% of those death sentences are actually upheld by the high courts.
Wait, let me just get my head around that. So more than 90% of the time, a high court looks at a death sentence passed by a lower court and says, no, this is wrong.
That's correct. And if you go one step higher to the Supreme Court, it's even starker.
How so?
The Supreme Court hasn't confirmed a single death sentence in the last 3 years. Not one. In fact, in 2025 alone, they actually acquitted and released 10 death row prisoners.
Acquitted. So not just commuting the sentence to life, but saying they were innocent.
Or at least that the evidence was so flawed or the investigation so botched that they shouldn't have been convicted in the first place, let alone sentenced to die.
So why is this happening? Why is the gap between what the trial courts are doing and what the higher courts are doing so wide?
The expat analysis in the source attributes this to what it calls increased hesitance in the appellate judiciary. The higher courts are looking very, very closely at the process.
And are finding problems.
Huge problems. Coerced confessions, evidence tampering, a total lack of effective legal representation for the accused. The thinking is that the lower courts might be responding to public outrage or the heinous nature of a crime.
Right, the pressure to get a conviction.
But the higher courts are stepping back and saying, hold on, the quality of this investigation does not meet the standard required to take a human life.
So we're left with this awful situation of hundreds of people just rotting in prison, living under the shadow of a death sentence that in all likelihood will never be carried out.
It creates a state of permanent limbo. It's a system at odds with itself.
Let's pivot to something entirely different to cleanse the palate a bit. We're going with the science section, and we're going to talk about a cow.
Yes, a cow named Veronica. This is from the article Bovine Breakthrough, and it really does challenge a lot of our basic assumptions about animal intelligence.
Okay, so introduce us to the protagonist here. Who is Veronica?
Veronica is a cow living in a meadow in Neuch, Austria. So not in a factory farm, which is important. Researchers Alice Auersberg and Antonio J. Osuna Mascaro received some footage of her doing something unusual.
And what was that?
She was manipulating a brush, not just rubbing against it, but actively using it. So they decided to run a controlled experiment.
Okay.
They gave her a brush, but not just any brush. It was a tool with a bristled end and a smooth handle end.
Now, cows rub against fences and posts all the time. That's just instinct, right? What did Veronica do that was different?
She manipulated the tool based on what her body needed. So when she wanted to scratch her upper body, which has thick, tough skin,
Right.
she used the bristled end, and she used a vigorous scrubbing motion.
Okay, that makes sense.
But, and this is the incredible part, when she needed to scratch her udders, which are extremely sensitive, she flipped the tool around.
No way.
She used the smooth handle end, and she changed her technique to gentle, careful forward pushes.
That's not instinct.
Yeah.
That implies she understands the properties of the tool, she understands the different properties of her own body, and she can map the two together to solve a problem.
Exactly. It fits the strict scientific definition of tool use. The source compares this moment to Jane Goodall's famous observation back in 1960.
When she saw the chimpanzees using sticks.
To fish for termites. That was the moment we as a species had to accept that humans aren't the only tool users. And this is being framed as a similar kind of moment.
So why are we only just figuring this out about cows now? I mean, we've domesticated them for 10,000 years.
The source has a great term for it, anthropocentrism.
Or human-centric.
We are. We assume they're dumb, so we don't look for signs of intelligence. But there's another crucial factor. Think about how most modern cattle live.
In barren industrial environments.
Exactly. They don't have objects to manipulate. They don't have problems to solve. Veronica lived in a rich, stimulating environment, so her latent cognitive abilities actually had a chance to surface.
It suggests that if we treated livestock differently, we might find they're much closer to us cognitively than we're frankly comfortable admitting.
It definitely complicates the ethics of the entire dairy and meat industry.
It really does.
Yeah.
Now, let's get back to hard economics. We have a text and context piece titled, "The High Cost of the India-U.S. Interim Trade Agreement." And the tone here is not celebratory at all.
No, it's highly critical. The source frames this deal not as a partnership of equals, but as a defensive maneuver by India to avoid essentially economic punishment from the U.S.
And this is all happening in the shadow of the Trump factor. Right, that's the context.
Yes. The backdrop is that punitive tariffs were imposed on a range of Indian goods in August 2025. This interim deal is basically the damage control.
But the terms described in the source sound incredibly lopsided.
They are. So the U.S. is reducing tariffs on Indian imports from 50% down to 18%.
Okay, so that's a reduction, a benefit for India.
It is. But in exchange, India is eliminating tariffs on all U.S. industrial goods and many agricultural products, down to 0%.
All industrial goods. That seems incredibly unbalanced.
It gets worse. On top of that, India has also committed to purchasing $500 billion worth of U.S. energy, aircraft, and technology over the next 5 years.
So it's a forced shopping spree to balance the trade deficit on their terms.
That's how the source presents it. And there's a huge geopolitical kicker in here as well.
The Russian oil.
The Russian oil. India has apparently agreed to stop importing Russian oil to avoid a separate 25% penalty tariff.
That feels like a major sovereignty issue. I mean, if the U.S. can dictate where India buys its energy and presumably has to monitor those purchases to enforce it.
The source argues it sets a very dangerous precedent for our strategic autonomy. But the most immediate domestic risk, the thing people are really worried about, is agriculture.
How so?
The deal, as written, does not explicitly protect Indian cereals. And the source quotes the U.S. Agricultural Secretary Brooke Rollins, who tweeted something about pumping cash into rural America through this very deal.
So the fear is that heavily subsidized American grain will just flood the Indian market.
And undercut millions of local farmers, yes. There was also a little note about resolving longstanding concerns regarding food imports.
Which is code for what?
That's diplomatic code for genetically modified foods, GM foods. India has resisted GM imports for decades for a variety of reasons. The expert analysis in this piece suggests this deal effectively kicks that door wide open.
Staying with the theme of chemicals and industry, but maybe looking at a potential solution now, we have another text and context piece, Catalyzing India's Bio-Based Chemical Revolution.
This acts as a really interesting counter-narrative to the petrochemical dominance we were just discussing. The world, and India with it, is trying to figure out how to pivot away from making chemicals out of crude oil.
Right, so instead of drilling for oil to make plastics or solvents, we're using, what, plants?
Essentially, yes. Biological feedstocks. Things like sugarcane, corn, starch, various forms of biomass. The goal is to produce essential industrial inputs.
Like what, for example?
Well, a good one is acetic acid. It's used in everything from paints and adhesives to textiles. And the source notes that India imported nearly $480 million worth of acetic acid alone in 2023.
So the logic is, we grow a lot of sugar cane. Why on earth are we spending $500 million importing acetic acid that's made from foreign oil?
That is the logic in a nutshell. And the government has introduced a new policy, the Bio-E3 policy, to support this shift. You have major players like Proj Industries and Godrej getting involved.
But there must be a catch. If it were that easy, we'd be doing it already.
Of course. The source highlights the major hurdle, which is what they call the green premium.
Meaning it's still more expensive than the old way.
Right now, yes. It's cheaper to pump oil out of the ground and crack it into chemicals than it is to ferment biomass at scale. The analysis argues that what we need are biofoundries, dedicated large-scale infrastructure to bring the cost down. If we can build that, we can reduce our import dependence and cut carbon emissions all at once.
Let's shift gears entirely. We've been very focused on systems and policy. Let's look at a life. We have a profile of the artist Gulammohammed Sheikh, titled The Polymath of Three Births.
This is a really beautiful meditation on creativity and a long life in the arts. Sheikh is 89 years old, and the source frames his entire life through his own concept, which he calls his three births.
I love that framework. It's so poetic. What are the three births?
So the first is his biological birth, 1937, in Surendranagar, Gujarat, a humble, small-town beginning.
Okay.
The second birth, he says, was in 1955. That's when he joined the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda, and he describes that as his intellectual awakening, leaving the dusty streets for a world of vision, color, and modernism.
And the third birth?
That was in 1963, when he went to the Royal College of Art in London. That was his entry into the global art world, the international discourse. But the key insight from the source is that he didn't discard the previous births as he went along. He layered them.
How does that show up in his work? The source describes a painting called Karawan, which means caravan.
Yes. It's a fantastic example. It depicts a giant boat drifting through these tumultuous, uncertain waters, and inside the boat are all these figures from his life and from history.
Who's in there?
Gandhi is there, the poet Kabir is there, Picasso is there, friends are there. It's a visual representation of how an artist carries their entire history. The small town, the Indian university, the global city, all at once inside them.
There's also a mention of something called the Santiniketan template. What is that?
That refers to the idea, really pioneered at Santiniketan, that an artist shouldn't just be a studio painter who is isolated from society. They should be a polymath, a public intellectual, and Sheikh embodies this. He writes poetry in Gujarati, he's taught generations of students, he writes art history. He lives this idea that art is an intellectual ecosystem, not just a commodity.
From the art world to the corporate boardroom, let's look at our first business source, the decoupling strategy, Suzlon's evolution.
This is a fascinating look at how a legacy company, a giant in its field, is trying to reinvent itself. Suzlon, the wind energy company, is basically splitting its operations in two. They're decoupling project development from project execution.
And they're creating something called a DevCo, right? A development company. What does that do?
Correct. So usually in the wind energy business, one company does everything. They find land, they get the permits, they do the wind studies, and then they build and operate the turbine.
It's all bundled together.
Right. Suzlon is creating a subsidiary that's dedicated solely to that messy, complex groundwork, the land acquisition, the environmental studies, the permits, and then they sell that ready-to-build project to an investor.
But what's their advantage here? Why is Suzlon better at this than some new, nimble startup?
One word: data. That is their hidden weapon.
Okay.
The source points out that Suzlon has 10,000 operating turbines across India. For decades, they've had masts up all over the country collecting wind data. They're sitting on, and I quote, a mountain of wind data.
So they aren't guessing where the wind blows. They know.
They know. And they can predict complex things like wake loss, which is how one turbine's turbulence blocks the wind for another better than anyone else because they have the historical data to model it.
Which means the projects the DevCo sells are de-risked.
Perfectly de-risked. They can go to an investor and say, we know with a very high degree of certainty exactly how much power this site will yield. And in the world of infrastructure finance, that certainty is incredibly valuable.
Staying in the business section, we have a broader, more strategic piece. charting India's ascent in the new global trade era. This feels like a bit of a reality check on all the free trade agreements we keep hearing about.
It is a huge reality check. The government, celebrates these deals with the EU or the U.S. as major victories, but the core argument of the source is access is easy, creating value is hard.
Meaning just because the door's open doesn't mean anyone actually wants to buy your stuff.
Exactly. The source warns very strongly against falling into the low-wage trap. For decades, India has relied on being the cheaper option.
Your cost advantage.
Right. But look at China's trajectory. Wages eventually rise. You cannot be the bargain basement forever. It's not a sustainable long-term strategy.
So what's the proposed solution? What's the path forward?
Brand building. Pure and simple. The expert in the piece points to the two-wheeler market as a perfect example.
Bajaj and TVS.
Bajaj and TVS. They didn't just export cheap, unbranded bikes. They went out and built global brands with a reputation for quality and engineering. The source argues that is the only sustainable path for Indian manufacturing.
It also mentions the importance of soft power.
It does. It notes that India currently ranks 30th globally in soft power and 38th in innovation. To improve this, the source suggests a very specific, practical tactic used by countries like Finland and the U.S.
Which is?
Make politicians the sales team. When the prime minister or a senior minister goes abroad for a bilateral meeting, they should be taking a delegation of industry captains with them to pitch India Incorporated as a cohesive brand, not just a collection of disparate vendors.
Now let's go to the foreign section. We're looking at Interpol's high-tech war against AI weaponization. This is all happening out of their hub in Singapore, and it sounds genuinely terrifying.
It does. The source describes the Cyber Fusion Center in Singapore, which is Interpol's global nerve center for cybercrime. And the key takeaway is that the threat landscape has completely shifted. We're not talking about lone hackers in basements anymore.
We're talking about organized crime.
Crime syndicates that are structured and run like multinational corporations, and they are using AI to scale up their operations exponentially.
What are the examples?
They're using deep fake videos to impersonate government officials or CEOs to authorize fraudulent transfers. They're using voice cloning to scam families. But the scariest development is the crime as a service model.
Crime as a service.
You can go to the dark web now and basically buy or rent a scamming tool that uses AI to automate phishing attacks or fraud. You don't need to be a skilled coder to be a cyber criminal anymore. You just need to be a customer.
There is a philosophical quote in here from an official, Toshinobu Yasuhiro, that really stuck with me. He says, AI has no soul, no heart.
It captures the emerging legal dilemma perfectly. If an autonomous AI agent commits a massive financial crime, who do you arrest?
The person who wrote the original code, the person who deployed it.
The user who rented it for an hour, the AI itself. As these systems become more autonomous, our legal frameworks, which all rely on the concept of human intent, of mens rea, are going to be tested very, very severely.
Okay, moving to our spotlight section for the last two pieces. We have a deep dive into a social trend: ethical non-monogamy, modern Indian marriage. This really challenges the stereotype of traditional Indian relationships.
It absolutely does. Ethical non-monogamy, or ENM, is defined here as committed couples who decide to explore other sexual or romantic partners, but with full consent and transparency.
And the stats quoted are pretty surprising.
They are. A Bumble study found that 61% of single Indians are actually open to exploring it. Gleeden, which is a dating app specifically for this demographic, already has 3 million users in India.
But the geography of this trend is what really jumped out at me. We all assume this is a big city thing, Mumbai, Bangalore, Delhi.
Right, a metropolitan phenomenon. But the expert in the piece notes that it's growing incredibly rapidly in Tier 2 cities, places like Guwahati, Lucknow, and Salem.
Wow. But the dynamic in those smaller towns is different.
It's very distinct. The source identifies what it calls the patriarchal twist.
Okay, what does that mean?
In the metros, you see a somewhat more equal exploration between partners. Both might be dating other people, but in smaller towns, the trend is often driven by the husbands.
So the men want to explore sexual variety.
And the wives are described in the article as reluctantly tagging along, or more often, consenting to the husband dating other people while not dating anyone themselves.
So the label is modern and ethical, but the underlying power dynamic is still very, very traditional.
That's the paradox. And the practical challenges are immense. Housing is a nightmare try, explaining to a landlord in a conservative city that you're a polyamorous throuple looking to rent a 2-bedroom.
You'd be laughed out of the office.
Absolutely. And the emotional labor is significant. Therapists at places like Omaha are seeing a huge surge in couples needing help managing jealousy and insecurity. So it's a paradoxical bubble, as the source calls it, growing acceptance online and in private, but still deep, deep stigma in the real world.
Finally, our last source today, also from the Spotlight section. Voices of the House, the Art of Parliamentary Interpretation.
This is such a wonderful tribute to a completely invisible workforce. Imagine the job for a second. You are sitting in a tiny, soundproof booth, listening to a complex political speech in English through your headphones.
Okay.
And you have to speak it out in Hindi or Tamil or Bengali simultaneously as it's being spoken.
The mental tax of that must be just incredible.
It's so intense they have to swap out every 30 minutes because the brain just fries. And the source highlights the unique grammatical problem. English is subject, verb, object. The minister introduced the bill.
Right.
But most Indian languages, like Hindi, are subject, object, verb. The minister the bill introduced.
So the interpreter has to wait for the English speaker to finish their entire thought to hear the crucial verb at the end.
But they have to have already started speaking the translated sentence in Hindi. It's a cognitive tightrope walk of the highest order.
And they do this for 23 languages.
23. And the history here is great. Back in 1952, the first speaker, Mavalankar, actually scoffed at the idea of translation. He just told MPs they should learn a common language and get on with it.
How times have changed.
Today, Parliament simply couldn't function without them. But there is a big looming threat on the horizon, AI, artificial intelligence. The piece gives the example of Saravam AI, a startup that recently dubbed the finance minister's entire budget speech in real time using a clone of her own voice.
And the interpreters see this coming.
They do. In a strange twist, they are even helping to train the government's own Bihashini AI translation initiative with their data.
Are they? Are they digging their own graves by doing that?
There's a lot of anxiety. The private conference market pays much better, up to 35,000 rupees a day versus Parliament's 6,000. But the prestige of Parliament is huge. The consensus seems to be that AI will probably take over the routine, straightforward work.
But not the tricky stuff.
But for high-stakes diplomacy, for a heated parliamentary debate where tone, sarcasm, and unspoken intent matter more than the literal words. The veterans believe you'll still need a human in the booth to read the room. AI can translate words, but it can't, as the source puts it, translate the heat of a debate. Not yet, anyway.
Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.